Hello everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the PlayStation 4 and see how this particular console holds up in 2024. Now, the funny thing is that this particular console was a very important console when it first came out, and it was leading us into that next generation of consoles, basically the 8th generation, that was a very interesting lineup because all of these consoles, the main ones being the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and the Nintendo Wii U, maybe the Switch they kind of throw in there too. This was a very monumental change, I would say, maybe not as big as the 7th gen, but it was still a very big change, and I would say a good entry point into the 9th gen that we're basically in right now. Now, here's the thing. I think the PlayStation 4, really any gaming console is still worth buying because, for any gaming console that has a good amount of games to it, that was the original intended way of playing those games. So there's really never going to be a point where buying a certain console is, completely worthless, but there might be better options, especially if newer consoles have backwards compatibility and different things like that. It may make a little bit more sense to go down that direction, but regardless, I will tell you the PlayStation 4 has a lot still going for it, and I'm still a big fan of this particular console, but it might make more sense to go and buy a different type of PlayStation 4 rather than this particular one, if I'm being honest. So, starting off with the outside of this particular console, it had a pretty good design. I was a big fan of this console once again when it first came out, and I really liked the design of this console. It's really weird because when I first saw this, the PS4 back in the first time I saw it was 2014 or 2013. It came out in 2013, but I don't think I saw it until 2014. I didn't like it. I love I actually like the design of this thing so much, and I was actually thinking to myself, how much better could Sony do than this console? This design is kind of timeless in a way. I actually like the Xbox One S probably a little bit more done than this one, but this console was just a beautiful looking console in so many different ways. On the front, you were getting this matte type of texture on one side, and then this reflective material on the other. You were getting USB ports on the front, which was very cool. And then you were getting that eject button as well on the top as well, or on the back on the front as well, which was really, really cool. On the sides, you weren't really getting anything super crazy, which was super nice. I didn't mind that. It was a very minimalistic looking console. But on the back side, you were getting the different port selection that you were basically offered. So you were essentially getting your optical out if you wanted to use that, your Ethernet port, an auxiliary port, and an HDMI port, as well as your AC adapter. So that was some really cool port selection to be able to basically choose on this particular device. And once again, it was actually a very cool thing going on with this particular console was that you had a good amount of ports on it. They didn't give us some weird proprietary port that we needed to use on a PSP or something. So that was something that was really cool with this particular console. And I would still say on the exterior, it still looks fairly good. There really isn't that much to complain about here on the exterior of this console. Now, the controller is another interesting thing going on here because I personally did like the controller, but it was a very interesting choice from Sony here because just like many other console goers at the time, they did actually throw in kind of a gimmick for this particular console. So on the front of this console, or on this controller, you did have that touchpad little thing that came up there. So this was something that was very funny because, personally for me, I don't know if it was necessarily the biggest deal in the world of having this type of, setup or having this digital touchpad that you had, but it was still a nice thing to have. And, I for one, if you're going to go and buy some sort of console, it's always nice to have for them to throw in a little bit more extra, even if it's a gimmick. So with this type of device and this type of console, what you were basically getting was with this type of controller, you're getting that touchpad, which allowed you to kind of maneuver around certain things. And I thought it was pretty cool. I thought it was funny. I never really used it at all, but it was still a cool thing to have. And I actually did like the controller a lot. This controller did have the micro USB port, which was actually very cool. At the time, it was fairly recent of a, controller port, and it still holds up very well. There's not really that much to complain about here with this controller side. Of course, if you're getting a newer controller, I think the PS5 controller is so much better, but this thing's actually not that bad either, and I'm still a pretty big fan of this particular controller from that particular perspective. So that right there is another pretty big deal in my opinion that gets a thumbs up for me. I think this controller holds up well. The battery life is still pretty decent, but again, because of this console and because how old this console is, the controller's battery life is probably degraded a little bit, but it's still totally okay, and I still think it's a pretty good controller when it comes down to it. So that right there pretty much gets a thumbs up for me. In terms of the gaming library though, this is the other crazy thing going on for this particular controller. I will tell you for the most part, there's so many games available for you on the PlayStation 4, and that's probably the biggest asset when you're buying this particular console. With something like the PlayStation 4, you can not only play all those PlayStation 4 games, but you can also play all those PlayStation 3 games and so many other virtual games that are available even before those consoles. So this is one of the biggest assets here, because there's not really a lot of different ways of playing a PlayStation 4 game unless you have a PlayStation 5, which costs more money. There may be some other consoles out there or other games out there that you can play cross-platform, but there are still lots of, like specific Sony exclusive games that Sony made that can only be played on a PlayStation console, and because of that, that actually puts this type of console in like so much of a lead in so many different ways. So I look at a console like the PlayStation 4, and I still think this thing has a little bit of a reason to buy it, but there's obviously other reasons why I would probably avoid this particular console. So this is where we get into this part of the video. The only problem, there's a couple problems I have with the PlayStation 4. For one, because this console isn't necessarily the latest and greatest, it might make a little bit more sense to not necessarily buy this particular PlayStation 4. There's, remember, two other PlayStations that Sony made. So they made the PlayStation 4 Slim and they made the PlayStation 4 Pro. Both of those consoles were overall better consoles than the original PlayStation 4. So if you were wanting to buy the PlayStation, in general, like a PlayStation or a newer one, you were better off buying something like the PlayStation 4 Slim or the PlayStation 4 Pro rather than this original PlayStation 4. And the reason for that was, one, it fixed a couple issues that you were getting with the PlayStation 4, the original one. There were some hardware issues and some fan noise issues. With the PlayStation 4 Slim, this did end up fixing a lot of those issues and made it much smaller as well. So that was kind of another reason why this particular console could have been a little bit of a better, idea than these other consoles like the PlayStation 4. But on top of that, if you want a console that's going to save you a lot more, time and headache in the future, you could always just buy a PlayStation 5. Like the PlayStation 5 is still fairly much supported. It's here for a long period of time. And once again, that might make a little bit more sense to go and buy that type of console than something like the PlayStation 4. So that's another console that I look at and I'm like, oh, like that one might make a little bit more sense for some people rather than something like the PlayStation 4. So that's another small minor thing to keep in mind. Again, not the biggest deal in the world, but just another small thing to kind of keep in mind there. Beyond that though, I will look at a console like the PlayStation 4 as it still being a fairly, interesting, important console for the most part. Like, I'm a big fan of the PlayStation 4, and I still think, like, if you're going to go and buy a console, does it get better than this? Clearly, yes. But I still think with this type of device, it is a very good console that Sony made, and I'm still a massive fan of this particular console for sure. It's not perfect by any means, and there definitely were lots of problems and issues that these particular consoles had, but I would tell you, if I were to sit here and recommend a particular console, like, I think it would definitely be something like a PlayStation 4 if you're wanting something that's fairly cheap and that's not going to cost that much money. On the flip side, if you're able to spend even a little tiny bit more money, or if you're able to go through and spend a little bit more money on a newer console, then the PlayStation 4 Slim, PlayStation 4 Pro, or the PlayStation 5, honestly, would probably be the better ones that I would recommend the average person to buy. Those ones make a lot more sense to me, and I just don't see why the average person would want to go down the direction of buying an original PlayStation 4 unless there's a reason why, or you have a deal on it, or somebody's selling it to you, whatever. Beyond that, I think a PlayStation 4 Slim or PlayStation 4 Pro or a PlayStation 5 are probably the better consoles here. So that basically covers it up here. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.